The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, welcome to a discussion with Barbara Delinsky. I'm Eileen Cavanaugh from the Hennepin County Library Program Office, and my guest today is the author of More Than Friends, a novel of romance. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you, Eileen.
Tell us how you got started writing romance fiction.
It's a very scary story, actually, because I could so easily not be here today. I have a degree in sociology, which I was planning to work in after my children were into school, and kept looking at the health wanted ads for, it seems like years, and didn't see anything I wanted. And one day read an article in the Boston Globe about women who wrote the category romance. I had never read one, but they made it sound very interesting and easy and lucrative. So I went out and bought and took from the library read 30 or 40 category romances within a 2-month period. I outlined them with paper and pencil, and then sat down and wrote my own, and it sold.
A rare, rare story, would you say?
It is. And people say, well, how did that happen? I think that I had the right product at the right timing, as well as I like to think the quality of that product just was in my favor. Worked very well.
Also, another thing that occurred to me as I read your book is that it's a contemporary romance as opposed to a historical romance, which I tend to think of when I hear the word romance. And modern day romances, yours seems not to fit that mold of modern day romance entirely.
No, I don't think it does. And in fact, when I look back, I don't think I ever really fit that mold of the romance writer. I am very into issues, and starting writing in the early 80s, I was dealing with issues that were very prominent in the news and in people's minds then. And I think that even my category romances, which were 90% romance, did have that realistic edge to it. Now, something like More Than Friends is 90% issues. There's always a love story, and there's always the emotion that goes around the love story, but there are so many other things in More Than Friends, so that I wouldn't even call it a romance at this point.
That's true. There are some twists and turns of plot, and there's suspense in your story. It almost seems kind of a blending of suspense and
suspense is wonderful to keep the pages turning. If you don't know how to keep things moving, you just throw in some kind of mystery, some kind of crime, some kind of other little element. In the case of More Than Friends, everything kind of unfolds in chapter 1, where we have two couples who have been friends for 20-some years. The girls roomed together in college. The guys were roommates also. The guys went on to law school. The girls, they got married. The different couples double dated, got married. The guys went to law school. But one of the women went on to get a degree, and the other one just became a homemaker. I don't mean just in a negative way, but she decided she wanted to be the one raising children.
That was what she really
exactly,
wanted to do.
In a very positive kind of way. Mm-hmm. She's a wonderful mother. They had children between them, and here they are now. This whole group of 4 adults and 5 children who are suddenly in chapter 1 torn apart by a momentary indiscretion between the husband of couple A and the wife of couple B. Unfortunately, one of the children witnesses this and races out of the house and is hit by a passing truck, which is driven by a man from his mother's past. But everything kind of unfolds from there. That element of mystery, more secrets unfold as the story goes on. For example, who is this guy driving the truck? Why were these two people together in the middle of the afternoon? Was there indeed some kind of true betrayal, or was it just a physical quirk?
And what happened that they never married?
Yes,
the man that was driving the truck.
Yes, that is exactly it. There's a whole background to that character, both of the characters, the one driving the truck and the woman who at one point in her life had loved him very deeply.
Let's talk about some of the contemporary themes that show up in More Than Friends. Marital infidelity, primary because it shows up first.
First, exactly. I think that's an issue that many people, I was going to say women, but I think it's everyone, has to deal with at some point, not only, or perhaps in their own lives, but with friends. They see it with parents, with children, or simply watching the news or watching movies, seeing things on television. It's a fact of the 90s, and a very unhappy fact, because, as is true in More Than Friends, marital infidelity creates shock waves that then people have to deal with. In the case of More Than Friends, we've got these people who are working so well together, and all of a sudden you've got these two families working as one. This marital infidelity tears them apart. There's almost a divorce between the two families. There is disillusionment between husband and wife, both sets. There is disillusionment between father and son, and father and daughter, and mother and son, and mother and daughter. All of these things, which are very real, I believe, and which readers are going to read and then say, oh wow, that really touches home in a very poignant kind of way. I deal with that issue, hopefully resolve it in a satisfactory way, although I think it is something that one can't tie up totally neatly. You just hope that you have learned from it, which I like to think that my characters have by the end of the book.
Do you think that marital infidelity, because it seems to be much more common now, is as destructive as it was, say, a generation ago in marriages?
I think so. I do think so, and I think that it is more destructive than a father, say, who is caught for embezzlement of funds. I think that it is, the family is a sacred unit. Husband and wife traditionally have been that sacred, and mother and father from the child's point of view. And I think that it is every bit as destructive. People don't get used to that because the family is that one stable thing in one's life. And when that family no longer exists, and it could be a one-parent family that something suddenly happens to. And when that happens, there's the foundwork of one's life that's shaken, the groundwork. So I think it is every bit as destructive. I think that we're learning now how to deal with it better. And I like to think that More Than Friends talks about some of those methods. Communication, for example. Why did this happen? Is it going to happen again? How can we prevent it from think about the problems that caused it and how we can help solve those so that this won't happen again. We have the tools more now to deal with it, but it is very painful.
Communication certainly seems to be one of the big problems in marriages that, as you say, is being perhaps more talked about today, but certainly Teak and her husband J.D. had never communicated very well, and maybe some of that was salvaged because of their closeness with the other couple. In fact, was it one big marriage?
Well, that's the question they have to ask themselves. In many ways it was. Clearly not physically. What happens in chapter 1 of the book is a fluke, and it has never happened before and will never happen again. In fact, after it happened, Sam, the fellow who was involved, the male half of that little thing, goes back and looks at videos that the families have made over the years. These families, mind you, share their vacation lives. They share a vacation home. They go away skiing together. Their houses, the backyards, back on each other, so that they run freely back and forth between the houses.
And they practically co-parent the children.
Exactly, they do. Each of the four has his or her role that help with these children. And then when that destructive force comes in, they have to try to cope with how do we work separately.
And they haven't been used to that.
No, they haven't. They haven't. And they have to learn, certainly, to do that.
And it's traumatic for their children because their children have been brought up apparently since the very beginning as part of one big, in fact, they even refer to themselves as the Popewells.
Exactly. That's how friends refer to them, because they're always together. In that sense. And they function beautifully that way. Whether they can function separately, they have to find that out, because that one thing happens that kind of tears them apart. And it's extremely painful for the kids who are missing these two parents who no longer are as close in their lives. there is a closeness, I think, that is rebuilt in the course of the story, because I don't like to think that they're never going to be able to go with problems to Annie or to JD for that matter. There is that closeness, but it's a different kind of closeness. I think they all realize that to some extent they've used this whole foursome as a crutch. It's perhaps what you said before, because they've had the foursome, they haven't had to face issues, weaknesses perhaps in themselves that other people in real life often have to face. Suddenly they do, and they have to decide, can I really do it all? Annie, for one, who is a college professor and has been very successful with her family and her career, in part because Teak is there at home, so that when her kids come home from school, if there's an emergency, Teak can help with it. Whereas when Annie comes home from work, if the kids have an emotional problem they want to discuss, they know they can go to Annie. Suddenly, Annie doesn't have Teak quite as freely as she had in the past. And she has to say to her husband, I'm not sure I can do it all. I thought I could do it. How am I going to function? How am I going to do Thanksgiving dinner? I've never done Thanksgiving dinner before. I have to work right up until the day before. Teak has always done it. I can't do it as well. Sam is a wonderful character in spite of that betrayal at the beginning. I adored Sam. He was the hardest to let go at the end of the book for me. He is terrific with Annie, and he does try to help out in his very primitive kind of way, so that Thanksgiving's a great success. But that's something I think people face all the time, especially around the time of holidays.
Speaking of loving your characters, do you ever carry them forward into another book?
I try not to. It's hard because you do get so attached to them, and at the end of a book, when I'm finished writing, it's hard to let go. It's kind of like a divorce or a death, because when I'm writing, they are with me 24 hours a day. Not even when I'm writing, when I'm planning too. For a book like More Than Friends, I will spend 9 months in the writing, kind of like growing a child inside. The first 5 may be in the planning stages, doing research, plotting the book, doing an outline, writing in-depth character studies so that I know exactly where my characters have come from, what their upbringings were like, what their educational backgrounds were, what their tastes are, what their parents are like. Then the rest of the 9 months is spent in the writing, another 4 months or so, in the actual writing of the book. I've lived with those characters constantly, and it is hard to let go. To carry them on to another book, I don't know. You do reach that point where to keep it fresh after 500 pages would be real tough. Plus the fact that if you have reached a conclusion at the end of one book, to throw them into another book means that you have to throw them into turmoil again, and I'm not sure I want to do that. They've already experienced so much turmoil. Let them just experience their happily ever after for a little while.
Enough for one life, perhaps. I think the reader is very sympathetic towards Sam, too, because after all, in this moment of indiscretion, he has come home, he's won a big law case, and he's ready to celebrate, and he's ready to celebrate with his wife, only she isn't there, and Teak is, and I think the reader feels very sympathetic toward what happened.
I think especially knowing that Sam didn't intend this to happen. Neither did Teak, for that matter. Here we have 2 people whose minds were elsewhere at the time that this physical thing happened. They were both thinking of the physical thing, but in terms of different people. And they never really anticipated that this could happen. I think they were just caught totally off guard. So many people have asked me with regard to More Than Friends, is it possible for men to have females as pure friends, or is there always a sexual overtone? And I think that it is possible. Certainly Sam and Teak were very, very good friends. They didn't intend to be more than friends until this thing happened. And afterward he looks over videos and tries to ask himself, did I want her all those years? And he really didn't. So I think for that reason too, the reader is willing to forgive Sam that indiscretion, certainly if his wife can.
In fact, Sam says at some point early on in the book, strange how life is. 3 hours ago I was the greatest, and now I'm less than nothing. It captures sort of the reality of how fragile life is and how fleeting glory is. And it also, to me, was an example of the stark realism that you include in your romance, in your contemporary romance.
Realism, I think, is my trademark. And there are some people who don't want it. There are some people who are reading romances and truly want a far greater amount of fantasy. I'm a very reality-oriented person. And as well as dealing with the issues, I deal with them in a realistic way. And I do think that my readers are finding that refreshing, perhaps, or are looking toward my books for that kind of realism. I actually like to think of my books as works of fiction that are almost like a Dear Abby kind of thing, where I'm dealing with those problems that people are experiencing, and they might certainly in their fan letters they say to me, I had that experience and you helped illuminate it. I like to feel that I'm showing one side of a solution to a problem, not everything. I'm certainly not putting myself up as an expert. This is not a self-help book. But I think with the reality in the book, it comes real close within that fiction genre to being a self-help book.
And sometimes fiction is an easier way to look at problems. It's sort of a step removed from one's own
Makes
problem.
it far more allowable for a person to put themselves into that situation. Some people don't want to go to a work of nonfiction and read about a problem they've experienced. They just are not attracted to that kind of thing. To read it through somebody else's eyes and someone else's life gives them the option of saying, no, it really wasn't me after all. Or, wow, that really was me. And gee, that illuminates that. That helps me understand why I did what I did, or why my husband did what he did, or my son or daughter, whatever.
It also allows for some creative solutions that may not show up
That's true.
in a real life.
That's true. It certainly allows for a happy ending, which, although I make a point not to tie every little string together at the end of a story, I do like to think that at least there's hope. At the end of More Than Friends, without giving it totally away, the characters each have resolved something in their minds, which isn't to say that they're going to go through and breeze through the rest of their lives totally happily, but I do think that there's hope that they've grown in the course of a book, which is a very important point for me, because I like to think that in life we all grow. I don't believe in the old dog not being able to teach that old dog new tricks. I think that no matter how old one is, you can learn from experiences if you think about them and look where you went wrong and communicate with people about those problems. So I think there is hope at the end of More Than Friends, which is that fiction.
It's interesting that when the book starts, they're living an almost perfect life,
Yes.
seemingly. In the end, they're leading a more realistic life.
I think so, which perhaps that ideal life at the beginning is not as real. I think it's fun. It was the Ozzie and Harriet kind of perfection that so many people want. Perhaps my readers will say, aha, they deserved this. I mean, nobody has that kind of perfect life. But I think that because I don't think they're less happy without having that perfect life. I think that they truly are deeper, more knowing characters at the end of the book. And I think every character, every major character in More Than Friends emerges feeling better about him or herself at the end of the book than at the beginning. Even in spite of that perfect life, I think they feel they understand themselves better. I think they feel that they have grown.
I was going to say there's been growth and change, and I think they are intimately linked to each other, that in this case it's forced change, but nevertheless it has produced growth, which is unfortunately often true in real life too.
Yes, I think one of the issues where that's particularly apparent is with J.D. and his father. And the issue I was dealing with there is how much, it concerns me a lot because I have seen this in real life, how much parents hold on to their adult children. J.D. is in his 40s. He's in his early 40s. And his dad
successful.
is very, and his dad is still got those talents in him. And I know as a parent, I'm always concerned, when do I let go? My youngest kids are going off to college next year. How much do I have to know about their lives and still be a responsible parent without holding on to, I need to let them fly just a little bit. J.D.'s father never quite let him fly, and J.D. was experiencing great turmoil because of this, wanting to be like Sam, who was very free and laid back and real successful too in his way, but yet having grown up under his father's wing, being so many of those same things were instilled as part of his personality. So he was very much a torn character, and I think for him in the course of the book he has to realize that his father, he does realize that his father's grip on him is not healthy at this point, and he has to break it somehow. And he does, I think, in the end, in a very subtle way, perhaps a way that his father, that's a little bit mean, perhaps. He kind of thumbs his nose at his father, but he needs to do that to just break free. And at this point, I'm rooting for J.D. as opposed to his father.
And at the end, he recognizes how good he feels about the freedom that he's experiencing.
Yeah. And it's the first time in his life that he has experienced it. One of the scenes that I love most is when J.D. is alone for the first time in his own apartment, the first morning. This is a man who grew up in a house where his mother ruled everything, and there was a housekeeper to do everything for him. He never had to make a bed or anything. And then he went off to college and ate in a dormitory and never made his bed. And then he got married right after college, and his wife, Teak, who is the wonderful homemaker and takes care of everything, she did it all for him. And all of a sudden, he's in an apartment and does not know how to do anything. And watching him try to make breakfast for himself, where he has bought the cereal and forgot the milk, where he puts the bagel in the toaster and it gets stuck so that smoke swirls. I mean, that's happened to all of us, where he spills oil on the floor. There's nothing worse in a kitchen than spilling oil on the floor, and then tries to clean it up with dishwashing liquid. The poor guy's trying, you know, even to the extent of bringing his clothes to be done at the nearby laundry and having his shorts starched. Well, he learns, you know, to speak up, and he learns the hard way how to deal with a lot of these things. And as the book progresses, he's able to make his breakfast, and he finds a cleaner who can do his laundry the way he wants it, and he really has grown. So that
sort of on the surface, he's solving some superficial problems, but you see that under the surface, he's solving some more serious
deeper
problems.
Definitely.
There's an interesting contrast too between the two women. Annie is a professor with her doctor's degree, and Teak didn't go any further than college, and wants to be a homemaker. She's a very dependent woman, which is another theme that shows up in the book. She's so out of it, sort of, that she doesn't have her own credit rating. She doesn't know how to balance a checking account.
Well, she's
vulnerable.
She is, in a way that so many women nowadays are. This is not unusual, and I think it is a 90s phenomenon where women who have been, when we say totally dependent, it simply means that their husbands have provided, at least in my mind, it means that their husbands have provided the wherewithal, the money to take care of things. Otherwise, Teak is very competent. She's an extremely competent woman as a mother. But no, she doesn't have a credit card, and she doesn't have any independent money that she socked away. She was the ideal kind of thing. I mean, her husband took care of all of those, and she had a certain amount of money at her disposal each week, and she took care of the food and did it all wonderfully. And the kids were always dressed just fine, and the house was always taken care of. She really managed that just in an incredible way. But yes, she does have to learn now how to take care of herself in those other ways.
Forgiveness is another theme. Can spouses forgive marital infidelity, or do they forgive but they don't really forget?
That, to me, I think is the key. Yeah, I think they can forgive. I don't personally believe they can ever forget. One can't forget a hurt like that, but one can learn from it. I think in More Than Friends, we have two examples. We've got two marriages, and this fact of infidelity has different effects on those two marriages, which is part of what I wanted to show. One marriage is able to deal with it and move beyond. The other marriage is not quite as successful in that. I think there are also issues of forgiveness when it comes to the friendships between both of the men and both of the women. And again, you know, whether or not women, in this case, will work harder to preserve a friendship than men will. That's a very interesting discussion I often have with my friends. I think that women fight harder sometimes for relationships, and perhaps will go back to their man or to their best friend who's had a one-time affair, in Teak's case, with with her husband, I think that they're more apt to be forgiving in that sense because they value the relationship if it has been a worthwhile relationship. Certainly with Annie and Sam, it was a beautiful marriage, and they did have a wonderful relationship. And they talk about this soul wire where the two of them can just know what the other is thinking, and they're just of one mind. And they temporarily lose that because Annie never dreamed Sam could be unfaithful. But then they do work to recreate it. She's willing to forgive him because that soul wire is so beautiful, and she wants to recreate it. And she sees, as she works toward understanding his feelings, she sees the wires begin to come together again. Also with Teak, same kind of thing. At first, she just doesn't want to talk about it with Teak, can't handle it. But she really adores Teak. They've been close for so many years. To just throw it all out because of 1 minute, one mistake. And I think that's what it was. It was a mistake. And I guess this is my message to readers. You know, you have to look at life and you have to say, is this a mistake, or is this a willful ruining of a relationship? In More Than Friends, it was a mistake. And yes, there are some people who can't forgive. And yes, everyone's always going to remember. The children are always going to remember. But I think there is forgiveness and there is a repair job that's gone on.
So it's an interesting contrast in marriage too. One marriage makes it, the other one is questionable. One man has a moment of indiscretion. The other man, we sort of learn as the story goes on, was probably involved in this as a long-term sort of acceptable way of life to him, which contrasts the. I mean, interesting too that the man who has the moment of indiscretion is the one who gets caught at it.
That's right. That's right. Yes.
And the other man never is held accountable.
That's right. Well, but in the end, he does suffer. I like to think J.D. really is a rat at the beginning, and when you learn these things about him, but when you learn that he has been unfaithful more than once to his wife. And he's the one who is so self-righteous when this happens. How could you do this to me? And it's so hypocritical. He, though, as the story goes on, I do try, with that scene in the kitchen that morning, to make him see, I try to let the reader understand where he's coming from. I don't believe myself that people are all good or bad. And I think that any bad person has come from somewhere. If one understands it, perhaps one can see the good and appeal to that particular good. I'm not sure J.D. is going to be faithful to whoever he dates, you know, for the rest of his life. It may be in his nature to try to get away with some things. But I think that he has become certainly a better parent. He tries, at the end of the book, he has to make more of an effort to be a parent. And that is something I hear about a lot from readers who write in and from friends. You know, when there is a divorce or a separation, sometimes the male is a far better father than he ever was when the marriage was intact, when things were taken for granted.
Well, Barbara, there's a lot more I'd like to discuss about More Than Friends, but we've run out of time. So thank you very much for being with us today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on a discussion with Barbara Delinsky.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.